The crystalline halls of the Galactic Assembly stretched higher than any building on Earth. Light from 3 distant suns poured through walls made of something that was not quite glass and not quite diamond, casting rainbows across the gathered representatives of 100 alien species. The air itself hummed with translation frequencies, turning 1,000 different languages into one. Daniel Cole stood at the center of it all, feeling very small and very human. He was 23 years old. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his suit was the finest Earth could produce, though it looked plain compared to the flowing robes and living garments worn by the beings around him. He carried no weapons because humans were not yet trusted with such things in council space. He had only his words and a speech he had practiced 1,000 times. This was humanity's first formal petition to the Galactic Council. After decades of limited contact and careful negotiation, Earth had finally been granted the chance to request observer status. It was not full membership. It was barely a seat at the table. But it was a beginning, and Daniel had been chosen to speak for 8 billion people. The pressure of that responsibility sat heavy on his young shoulders. He looked up at the assembled delegates. Some had too many eyes. Others had none at all. Some floated in tanks of liquid or hovered on fields of energy. The delegation was a single massive consciousness spread across 12 bodies. The ambassador was technically a colony of microscopic organisms shaped into humanoid form. Compared to these ancient and powerful beings, humanity was a child species, barely crawling out of its cradle. But Daniel believed in what he had come to say. He cleared his throat and began his speech. He spoke of humanity's desire for peaceful cooperation with the galactic community. He talked about the exchange of knowledge and culture, about the benefits of diversity in thought and approach. He mentioned Earth's struggles and triumphs, the wars they had overcome, and the unity they were slowly building. He painted a picture of a young species eager to learn and ready to contribute. It was a good speech. He had worked on it for months with the best diplomats and writers Earth had to offer. Every word was chosen with care. Every phrase was designed to appeal to council values of cooperation and growth. When he finished, the assembly was silent. Daniel waited, his heart beating faster than he wanted to admit. He searched the faces around him for some sign of their reaction, but alien expressions were impossible to read. Then he heard it, a laugh. It started soft but grew louder, ringing through the crystal chamber like bells. It came from the elevated thrones where the 5 great powers of the council sat, and Daniel turned to find its source. Princess Seraphine of the Empire rose from her seat beside her father. She was beautiful in a way that made Daniel's breath catch despite his training. Her skin was silver and seemed to glow faintly from within. Her eyes held depths of violet and gold that shifted like nebulae. Her white hair flowed around her like a living thing, and when she moved, it was with a grace that made human dancers look clumsy. She was laughing at him. The sound filled the chamber as she stepped forward, and Daniel felt heat rise to his face. He forced himself to remain still, to keep his expression neutral, to remember his training. Do not react emotionally. Do not show weakness. Maintain diplomatic composure at all times. Seraphine raised one elegant hand, and the laughter stopped, though her smile remained. She addressed the assembly in a voice that was musical and sharp at the same time. "This soft creature speaks of partnership," she said, gesturing at Daniel with casual dismissal. "Look at him. Study this example of what humanity offers the galactic community." Daniel felt 100 different eyes turn to examine him more closely. "No natural armor," Seraphine continued, walking slowly down from her throne. "A child could crush his bones with one hand. No telepathy. He cannot even sense the emotions of those around him without crude guesswork. No enhanced senses. He sees a tiny fraction of the light spectrum and hears only a narrow band of sound." She circled him slowly, and Daniel remained motionless. "His species lives barely a century. Some of us remember the birth of stars that will outlast his entire civilization. They cannot breathe in most atmospheres. They cannot survive the cold of space or the heat of most worlds. They must wrap themselves in metal shells and artificial environments simply to exist beyond their single fragile planet. Seraphine stopped in front of him and looked into his eyes. She was taller than him by several inches, and she used that height to look down at him with something that might have been pity if it had not been so clearly contempt. "And yet they come here," she said, turning back to the assembly, "to the center of galactic civilization, built over millions of years by species who mastered the stars when humans were still learning to make fire. They come asking to sit among us as equals. They speak of partnership and contribution as if they have anything to offer us that we do not already possess." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Some species nodded in agreement. The collective shifted in what might have been discomfort or approval. The ancient ambassador watched with an expression that revealed nothing. Seraphine smiled at the crowd. "Perhaps we should be kind to them," she said, her tone light and mocking. "Perhaps we should place them in a preserve, something quaint, a protected space where they can develop at their own pace, safe from the dangers of a galaxy they are clearly not ready for, a curiosity for our children to study, a reminder of how far we have all come." More laughter now from several delegations. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to make it clear that her words had found agreement. Seraphine turned back to Daniel. "What do you say, little human? Would you like that? A safe place where your fragile species can play at civilization until you are ready for something more." The assembly waited for his response. Many expected tears or anger. Some hoped for desperate pleading that would provide further entertainment. Others simply wanted to see how this primitive creature would react to being so thoroughly humiliated before the powers of the galaxy. Daniel Cole stood perfectly still. His face showed nothing. Not anger, not shame, not hurt. His eyes met Seraphine's, and for one moment something passed between them, something she could not name and would not understand for many years. Then he bowed. It was a simple gesture, neither deep nor shallow. It acknowledged her position without accepting her judgment. It was respectful in form but offered no submission in spirit. And then Daniel Cole turned and walked out of the chamber without a single word. He did not look back. He did not pause. He simply walked through those crystal halls, past 100 alien species, and out into the cold light of foreign stars. The silence he left behind was louder than any speech could have been. Seraphine stood frozen, her mocking smile fading into something else. She had expected many reactions. Anger would have proven his species was emotional and unstable. Tears would have confirmed their weakness. Arguments would have given her more material for ridicule. Even dignified acceptance would have been a kind of surrender. But this wordless departure was something she had not anticipated. It was not defeat. It was not retreat. It was something else entirely, and for the first time in her long life, Princess Seraphine did not know what to make of it. The assembly voted that day to deny humanity's petition. Earth would not receive observer status. The young species would remain outside the galactic community, watching from the edges of civilization. But as Seraphine returned to her throne, she found herself unable to forget the look in Daniel Cole's eyes the moment before he turned away. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself he was nothing. She told herself she had won. She would spend the next 27 years learning how wrong she was. Daniel Cole returned to Earth on a borrowed transport ship. The journey took 3 weeks, and he spent most of it alone in his small cabin, staring at the stars through a tiny window. The diplomatic team that had accompanied him tried to offer comfort and reassurance. They told him he had done his best. They said the council was not ready to accept humanity. They promised there would be other chances. Daniel thanked them politely and returned to his silence. When the ship landed in Geneva, where Earth's unified government had its headquarters, Daniel was met by a crowd of reporters and officials. They wanted statements. They wanted explanations. They wanted to know what had happened in that crystal chamber and why humanity's petition had failed. Daniel walked past them without a word. For the next 6 months, he refused all interviews. He declined every invitation to speak about his experience. When the government offered him another diplomatic position, he turned it down. When universities asked him to lecture about alien civilizations, he said no. When publishers offered enormous sums for his story, he ignored them. Instead, Daniel Cole enrolled in engineering school. His former colleagues thought he had suffered a breakdown. Some believed the humiliation had destroyed his confidence. Others assumed he was running away from his failure, hiding in technical work, because he could not face the political world that had rejected him. They were all wrong, but Daniel did not bother to correct them. He studied harder than anyone in his class. He worked longer hours than students half his age. He earned degrees in propulsion systems and materials science and quantum mechanics. He took jobs at small companies and large corporations, learning everything he could about how things were built and why they worked. Years passed. Daniel's name faded from public memory. The young diplomat who had been mocked before the Galactic Assembly became a footnote in history books, mentioned briefly and then forgotten. Earth moved on, developing its own technology in isolation from the galactic community. Trade with council species was limited. Cultural exchange was minimal. Humanity was alone among the stars. But humanity did not stop. Without access to galactic technology markets, human engineers had to solve problems themselves. They could not buy faster-than-light drives from so they developed their own. They could not purchase shield generators from so they invented new ways to protect their ships. They could not use council communication networks, so they created quantum entanglement relays that eventually worked better than anything the galaxy had seen. Necessity drove innovation. Isolation bred independence. And slowly, quietly, humanity began to change. Daniel was part of that change. He moved from company to company, project to project, always pushing the boundaries of what human technology could achieve. He never sought leadership positions or public recognition. He preferred to work in the background, solving problems that others said were impossible. When someone asked him about his time as a diplomat, he simply said he had learned that words were not enough. Across the galaxy, Princess Seraphine noticed these changes. She had become Empress Seraphine now, inheriting her father's throne after his passing. The empire had stood for 10,000 years under her family's rule, and she intended to maintain that legacy. She was wise and fair, beloved by her people, feared by her enemies. She commanded fleets that could darken stars and armies that had conquered 100 worlds. But something troubled her in the quiet hours of her long nights. She found herself thinking about that human diplomat, not often at first, a passing thought here and there, easily dismissed. But as years became decades, the memories grew stronger instead of fading. She remembered his speech. It had been forgettable, really. The words of a young man who did not fully understand the world he was trying to enter. She had heard better speeches from children in her own court. But she could not forget his departure. The stillness of his face, the bow that somehow conveyed both respect and defiance, the way he walked out without looking back, without pleading, without showing any of the emotions she had expected to provoke. She had humiliated representatives from powerful species who broke down in tears. She had faced warriors from conquered worlds who raged helplessly against her judgment. Never had anyone simply walked away as if her words were nothing more than wind. Seraphine began requesting intelligence reports on humanity. Her advisors found this strange but obeyed. The reports showed steady technological advancement. Human ships were becoming faster and more capable. Their weapons were growing more sophisticated. Their population was expanding to new colonies at a rate that surprised even optimistic projections. She requested specific information about Daniel Cole. The intelligence operatives had to dig deep to find him. He had changed careers so completely that most records did not connect the young diplomat to the middle-aged engineer working quietly in a research facility. But they found him eventually and compiled a detailed file on his activities. Seraphine read the file alone in her private chambers. She learned about his degrees and his jobs and his projects. She discovered that he had helped design the propulsion system for humanity's class of starships. She found records of patents in his name for technologies that her own scientists could not fully understand. But nowhere in the file was any mention of revenge or ambition or bitterness. He did not give speeches about the injustice of the council's rejection. He did not write angry articles about arrogance. He simply worked, day after day, year after year, building things that pushed humanity forward. Seraphine closed the file and sat in darkness for a long time. She was beginning to understand what she had seen in his eyes that day. It was not weakness. It was not defeat. It was patience. The kind of patience that could outlast mountains. The kind of patience that did not need to speak because it knew time would prove everything words could not. She had mocked him for humanity's fragility, their short lives, their dependence on technology to survive. But she had missed something important. She had missed the thing that made humans dangerous. They did not accept limitations. They did not surrender to circumstances. When the galaxy told them they were not good enough, they did not argue or beg or despair. They simply went home and got to work. Seraphine thought about her own species. They had reached the stars 100,000 years ago. Their technology had been advanced for so long that innovation had slowed to a crawl. Why develop new methods when the old ones worked perfectly well? Why push boundaries when comfort was already achieved? Humans had none of that comfort. They had only hunger and drive, and the stubborn refusal to accept that anything was impossible. 20 years after that day in the assembly, Seraphine summoned her chief scientists and asked them a question that shocked them all. If humanity continues developing at their current rate, she said, how long before they surpass us? The scientists laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke. When they realized she was serious, they ran calculations and projections and simulations. The answers varied, but the conclusion was consistent. Not long, perhaps a century, perhaps less. Seraphine dismissed them and stood alone at her window, looking out at the stars of her empire. She thought about Daniel Cole walking out of that chamber 20 years ago. She thought about the bow he had given her, respectful but unbroken. She thought about the promise she had not recognized until now. Somewhere in human space, an engineer was probably bent over a workbench at this very moment, designing something that would change the balance of galactic power. He was not doing it for revenge or recognition. He was doing it because that was simply what he did. And Seraphine, Empress of the Empire, ruler of 10,000 worlds, found herself wondering if she had created her own destroyer with a single mocking laugh. She would have 7 more years to wonder before she learned the answer. The void swarm came from the darkness between galaxies. No one knew where they originated or why they existed. They were not quite alive and not quite machine, something terrible caught between organic tissue and cold metal. They moved through space in numbers that counting, billions upon billions of creatures ranging from the size of insects to the size of moons. They did not communicate. They did not negotiate. They simply consumed. Ancient records spoke of them. The oldest species in the galaxy had legends of a great darkness that swept through civilization before recorded history began. Entire empires had vanished without trace. Worlds had been stripped to bare rock. The swarm came, devoured everything in its path, and eventually retreated back into the void. Now they had returned. The first attacks hit the outer colonies of minor species. The Council dismissed the reports as exaggeration or local conflicts. When a patrol fleet was destroyed near the galactic rim, attention finally turned to the threat. When the swarm consumed 3 major trade worlds in a single month, panic began to spread. Empress Seraphine stood in her war chamber, surrounded by holographic displays showing the state of the galaxy. Red markers indicated swarm presence. Green markers showed council military positions. Yellow markers represented civilian populations awaiting evacuation. There was too much red and not enough green. The Armada was the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever known. 10,000 capital ships, hundreds of thousands of support vessels, weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand stellar explosions. For no enemy had been able to stand against might. The swarm did not care. They threw themselves at defensive lines in endless waves. When 1,000,000 were destroyed, 10 million more appeared. They did not fear death because they did not understand it. They did not retreat because they had no concept of defeat. They simply kept coming, absorbing losses that would have broken any conventional enemy. 7 major engagements in 3 months. 7 devastating defeats. Seraphine watched another system fall on her displays. 30 billion people had lived on those worlds. Farmers and teachers and children and artists. All of them gone now, consumed or fleeing toward a core that grew smaller every day. Her advisors spoke in urgent tones around her. They discussed fleet movements and resource allocation and evacuation priorities. They argued about which systems could be saved and which had to be abandoned. They debated strategies that might slow the swarm's advance. None of them had a solution that could actually win. "There is one option we have not considered," said Lord, her chief advisor. He was old even by standards, silver-haired and bent with centuries. But his mind remained sharp, and his counsel had guided 3 generations of emperors. Seraphine knew what he was going to say. She closed her eyes. "The humans have developed weapons we do not understand," continued carefully. "Our intelligence reports indicate capabilities that surpass even our most advanced technology. Their fleet is small, but if we could negotiate—" "No." The word came out harder than she intended. The war chamber fell silent. Every advisor turned to look at their empress, surprised by the emotion in her voice. Seraphine opened her eyes and stared at the red tide spreading across her displays. 27 years of memories pressed against her mind. A young man standing alone in a crystal chamber. A laugh that had echoed across the galaxy. A wordless departure that had haunted her ever since. She could not ask him for help, not after what she had done. "The humans have no obligation to us," she said, her voice controlled again. "We rejected them. We mocked them. We told them they were unworthy of standing beside us. Why would they risk their people to save those who humiliated them?" "Because they would prove they are better than we are," replied quietly. "Is that not what we fear most?" Seraphine had no answer to that. The weeks that followed were the darkest of her reign. The swarm continued its advance. Colonies burned. Allied species fled toward the galactic core, overwhelming resources and spreading chaos. The council met in emergency sessions that produced nothing but arguments and blame. And still the red tide spread. Seraphine stopped sleeping. She spent her nights in the war chamber, watching her empire die one system at a time. She made decisions that cost millions of lives, choosing which worlds to defend and which to abandon. She ordered retreats that her ancestors would have considered unthinkable. She did everything she could think of. It was not enough. Finally, with the swarm less than 100 light-years from Prime itself, Seraphine did something she had never done in her long reign. She sat alone in her private chambers and recorded a message. Her hands trembled as she spoke, though her voice remained steady. She addressed the message to Earth's government. She explained the situation. She described the threat. She asked, formally and officially, if humanity would be willing to send aid. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. The response came 3 days later, but it did not come from Earth's government. It arrived on a private channel, encrypted with codes that should have been unbreakable, but somehow reached her personal systems without interference. The message was text only, simple words on a screen. "I will come, but I will speak only with you." It was signed Daniel Cole. Seraphine stared at those words for a very long time. Her hearts beat faster than they should have. Her silver skin flushed with something she refused to identify. She had wondered for 27 years whether he remembered that day. Now she had her answer. He remembered. She sent a response granting him permission to enter space. She arranged for his passage through military checkpoints. She cleared a landing pad at the Imperial Palace itself. Then she waited. The days until his arrival were strange. The war continued. The swarm advanced. Billions more died. But Seraphine found herself thinking less about the crisis and more about the meeting to come. What would she say to him? What could she say? How do you address a man you humiliated before the entire galaxy? She considered apologizing. She practiced the words in her mirror, watching her own face as she spoke them. They sounded hollow, insufficient. What apology could possibly make up for what she had done? She considered being formal and diplomatic, treating this as a simple negotiation between nations. But that felt like another kind of cowardice, pretending the past did not exist. In the end, she decided to simply see what happened, to let him lead and follow where he went. She owed him that much at least. When word came that his ship had entered the system, Seraphine felt something she had not experienced in centuries. Fear mixed with anticipation mixed with something else she could not name. Daniel Cole was coming back. And this time, she would not make the mistake of laughing. The ship that entered space was small. It was barely larger than a personal shuttle, a tiny speck against the backdrop of massive capital ships and defensive platforms. Seraphine's engineers watched its approach with instruments that should have been able to analyze every detail of its construction. The readings made no sense. The ship moved in ways that seemed to ignore conventional physics. It accelerated without visible propulsion. It changed direction without losing momentum. Its hull was made of materials that their sensors could not identify. Energy readings fluctuated in patterns that explanation. One engineer, a woman who had spent 2 centuries studying alien technology, put down her instruments and simply said she did not understand what she was looking at. Seraphine watched the ship descend through the atmosphere toward her palace. She had ordered all guards and officials to remain at a distance. Whatever happened in this meeting would happen between the two of them alone. The ship landed on a private platform outside her personal chambers. It touched down without sound or disturbance, settling onto the stone like a leaf falling onto still water. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a section of the hull simply opened, and Daniel Cole stepped out. He was 50 now. The dark hair she remembered had gray at the temples. Lines had formed around his eyes and mouth. His hands, which she could see were strong and calloused from years of physical work, showed the marks of age. But his eyes were the same, quiet, watchful, revealing nothing. Seraphine stepped forward to meet him. She was still taller than he was. She was still beautiful by any standard, though the centuries had given her face a severity it had not possessed in youth. She was still empress of the most powerful empire the galaxy had ever known. But she did not feel powerful as she stood before him. "You came," she said. The words felt inadequate the moment they left her mouth. "You asked." His voice was deeper than she remembered, calmer. There was no anger in it, no bitterness, just a simple statement of fact. Seraphine led him into her private chambers. The doors closed behind them, and suddenly they were alone together for the first time since that day in the assembly. The weight of 27 years pressed down on the silence between them. She did not know how to begin. She had prepared speeches and explanations and apologies, but now all of them seemed useless. So she simply asked the question that had burned in her mind since she received his message. "Why, after what I did to you, why would you come?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He walked to her window and looked out at the sky of Prime. The stars were dimmer now, obscured by defense shields and orbital platforms. In the distance, the shapes of warships moved against the darkness. "What you did to me," he said finally. "I was a young man who gave a mediocre speech. You were a princess who saw exactly what I was and named it honestly. You were not wrong." Seraphine felt something twist in her chest. "I was cruel." "Yes," he turned to face her, "but cruelty and truth are not mutually exclusive. Your words were designed to hurt me, but that does not mean they were false. Humanity was fragile. We were weak. We had nothing to offer a galaxy of ancient civilizations. Everything you said about us was accurate. That does not make it right." "No, but it made it useful." Daniel's expression did not change, but something in his voice shifted. "I learned something that day, about what humanity needed to become, about what I needed to become. Your mockery was a gift, though you did not intend it as one." "A gift?" Seraphine could not keep the disbelief from her voice. "You showed me that words were not enough, that speeches and petitions and diplomacy were meaningless without strength behind them. You showed me that the galaxy would never respect us until we earned that respect through action." He paused. "So I stopped talking and started building." "Yes." They stood in silence for a moment. Seraphine studied his face, searching for something she had been looking for since he walked away all those years ago. "I spent 27 years wondering about you," she admitted. "I told myself I did not care. I told myself you were nothing. But I watched your species grow, and I knew you were part of that growth. I watched humanity develop technology that amazed our scientists, and I knew you had a hand in it. You were tracking me." "Yes, there was no point in denying it. I wanted to understand something." "What?" Seraphine moved closer to him, close enough to see the details of his weathered face, the steadiness of his breathing, the patience in his stance. "When you walked out of that chamber," she said, "I expected you to break. I expected tears or anger or defeat. Instead, you just left. You bowed and walked away without a single word. I have thought about that moment more than I want to admit. What were you thinking?" Daniel was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "I was thinking that you were right about almost everything. Humanity was not ready. I was not ready. We had nothing to offer but potential, and potential is worthless until it becomes reality." He met her eyes. "But I was also thinking that you had made a mistake." "What mistake?" "You assumed my silence was acceptance. You thought I was walking away in defeat." A faint smile crossed his face, the first emotion she had seen from him since he arrived. "I was not." "Then what was it?" "A promise, to myself and to everyone watching. A promise that one day I would return with something more than words, something that would make speeches unnecessary." Seraphine felt the weight of those decades bearing down on her. All those years of wondering. All those nights thinking about a human who had walked away without breaking. All those fears about what humanity was becoming. "And now you have returned," she said, "with something more than words." "Yes." "What is it?" Daniel smiled again, and this time there was something fierce behind it. Something that made Seraphine understand why her intelligence reports had used words like dangerous and unprecedented when describing human technological development. "Something that can kill the swarm." He pulled a small device from his pocket and activated it. Holographic displays filled the chamber, showing ship designs and weapon schematics and battle plans. Seraphine's eyes widened as she studied them. She had led fleets for centuries. She knew warfare better than almost anyone alive. What she was looking at would change everything. "This is what humanity has been building," Daniel said, "while the galaxy ignored us, while the council debated whether we were worthy of notice, while your empire slept in comfort and stagnation." He gestured at the displays. "This is what happens when you tell humans they are not good enough. We prove you wrong." Seraphine stared at the holographic plans. Ships that moved faster than anything the galaxy had seen. Weapons that exploited weaknesses in swarm biology that scientists had not even discovered. Strategies that combined human adaptability with computational precision. "You could have kept this for yourselves," she said. "You could have let the Council fall and claimed the galaxy for humanity." "Yes. Why did you not?" Daniel deactivated the display and looked at her with those quiet, patient eyes. "Because I did not spend 27 years working for revenge. I spent them working so that one day, when the moment came, I would have something worth offering." He paused. "Something more than words." Seraphine felt tears forming in her eyes. She had not cried in centuries. She had thought herself beyond such weakness. But standing here, facing the man she had mocked and dismissed and underestimated, she could not hold them back. "I am sorry," she said. "I know it is not enough. I know nothing I say can undo what I did, but I am sorry." Daniel nodded slowly. "I know. Do you forgive me?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised her more than anything else he could have offered. "There is nothing to forgive. You did exactly what you should have done. You showed humanity the truth about ourselves, and we used that truth to become something better." He reached out and touched her hand. It was a simple gesture, human and warm, and Seraphine felt something shift in her chest. "Now," Daniel said, "let me show you how we are going to save your empire." The human fleet arrived at Prime 3 days, before the swarm was projected to reach the system. Seraphine had expected a small force. Human space was vast but sparsely populated, and their military had always been described as defensive rather than expansionary. Intelligence reports had suggested perhaps 100 vessels at most. She was wrong. Ships emerged from faster-than-light travel in waves that seemed endless. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. They were not as large as capital ships, but their designs were unlike anything the galaxy had seen. Sleek and angular, they moved with a precision that suggested perfect coordination. Their hulls shimmered with energy patterns that made targeting systems struggle. By the time the last ship arrived, there were over 8,000 human vessels in formation around Prime. Seraphine stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching the impossible sight through the main. Around her, officers stared in stunned silence. One of them, a decorated admiral who had served her family for 300 years, simply sat down and put his head in his hands. Daniel Cole stood beside her, his expression calm. "You told me your fleet was small," Seraphine said. "It was 27 years ago." "What changed?" "Everything." Daniel gestured at the display. "Every one of those ships carries weapons based on principles your scientists have not discovered yet. Every captain has been trained in tactics designed specifically to exploit swarm weaknesses. Every system is networked together in ways that allow perfect real-time coordination." He looked at her. "This is what humanity built while the galaxy was not paying attention." The swarm arrived the next morning. They came in numbers that darkened the stars. Billions of creatures ranging from small fighters to massive hive ships larger than moons. They moved with the mindless hunger that had consumed civilizations since before recorded history. They did not hesitate or hold back. They simply threw themselves at the defenders in an endless tide. The Battle of Prime began with fire. Human ships moved first. They did not form defensive lines or protective formations. Instead, they split into hundreds of smaller groups and plunged directly into the swarm. It looked like suicide. It looked like madness. But those small groups moved with impossible coordination. They wove between swarm formations, avoiding mass concentrations and striking at weak points. Their weapons fired energy beams that burned through swarm biomass like hot knives through ice. When the creatures tried to swarm them, they simply were not there anymore, having jumped to new positions using drives that seemed to ignore the limitations of space itself. Seraphine watched in disbelief as the human fleet cut paths through the swarm that should not have been possible. "Your ships are destroying thousands of them," her tactical officer reported, his voice shaking. "But there are billions more. They cannot possibly—" "Watch the hive ships," Daniel interrupted quietly. Seraphine turned her attention to the massive swarm command vessels. They were surrounded by protective formations of smaller creatures, supposedly impenetrable to conventional attack. But as she watched, she saw human ships converging on them from multiple angles, their movements perfectly synchronized. The first hive ship exploded in a burst of violet energy. The swarm around it went mad. Creatures that had been moving with coordinated purpose suddenly scattered in random directions. Some turned on each other. Others simply stopped moving entirely and drifted lifeless through space. "The swarm is a hive mind," Daniel explained as another hive ship died. "Remove enough central nodes and the entire system collapses. Your scientists were looking for a way to kill them one at a time. We found a way to kill them by the billion." Seraphine felt hope rise in her chest for the first time in months. She turned to her communications officer. "Signal all vessels. We are joining the attack. Coordinate with Human Tactical Command for target assignments." For the first time in the history of the galaxy, human and ships fought side by side. The battle lasted 18 hours. Wave after wave of swarm creatures threw themselves at the defenders, but each wave was smaller than the last. Hive ships fell one after another, and with each one, the swarm's coordination deteriorated further. By the end, the remaining creatures were barely functional, easy targets for cleanup operations. When the last swarm signature disappeared from sensors, silence fell across the fleet. Then the cheering began. Human ships and ships broadcast to each other. Crews who had never met celebrated together across the void of space. Ancient rivalries and old prejudices seemed to evaporate in the shared relief of survival. Seraphine watched it all from her bridge, tears streaming down her silver cheeks. Beside her, Daniel Cole stood quietly, his expression unchanged. "You saved us," she said. "We saved ourselves, together." The days that followed were busy. Cleanup operations, medical evacuations, damage assessments. The swarm had been defeated at Prime, but they still held territory across the galaxy. There was much work left to do. But there was also time for one more meeting. Seraphine found Daniel alone on an observation deck, watching repair drones swarm over damaged vessels. The stars of her empire burned bright above them, no longer obscured by fear. She stood beside him without speaking. For a long moment, they simply watched the ships together. "The Council has voted," she said finally. "Unanimously, Earth will receive full membership, not observer status, full membership with complete rights and representation." Daniel nodded slowly. "Good. I spoke in favor of it. I told them the truth about what happened 27 years ago. I told them I was wrong. I told them you came to save us anyway." "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did." Seraphine turned to face him. "I need to ask you something, something I have wondered about since you came back." "Ask." "Why did you really come?" "Not because I asked. You could have let us fall. After what I did to you, no one would have blamed humanity for staying out of this war. You could have watched the Council burn and taken your revenge without lifting a finger." Daniel was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was soft. 27 years ago, you laughed at a boy who had nothing but words. You were right to laugh. He was weak. He was unprepared. He had no business standing before the powers of the galaxy and asking for their respect." He turned to look at her, and Seraphine saw something in his eyes she had never forgotten. The same thing she had glimpsed the moment before he walked away all those years ago. She finally understood what it was. Not weakness, not defeat, not patience. Love. "But you made one mistake in your assessment," Daniel continued. You thought my silence was surrender. You thought I was walking away because you had beaten me. What was it really? A promise. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her silver skin. A promise that one day I would return with something more than words, something that would prove what I could not say. And what was that? Daniel smiled. It was the warmest expression she had ever seen on his face. That humanity was worth believing in, that I was worth believing in, that even if you did not see it yet, one day you would. He squeezed her hand, and I did not need to speak for you to understand. Seraphine felt tears on her cheeks again. She stepped closer to him, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his single human heart. I understand now, she whispered. I know, Daniel said. That is why I came. They stood together in silence, watching the stars, and for the first time in 27 years, neither of them needed words. The princess who had laughed and the diplomat who had walked away were gone. In their place stood an empress and an engineer, their hands intertwined, their future unwritten. Outside the observation deck, the galaxy turned slowly toward a new day. Human ships flew alongside vessels. Council representatives discussed treaties and alliances that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Somewhere in the void, the remnants of the swarm fled before fleets that carried the banner of a united civilization. And on a quiet observation deck above Prime, two people who had spent 27 years waiting finally found what they had been looking for. Each other.